Now, let's talk migration, should we? Because the Prime Minister says he hasn't lost control of migration despite it hitting that record high. Apparently, it's gone up, the net migration figure gone up by 606,000 in 2022.
Well, meanwhile, Labour says the asylum processing backlog has surged to a record high under Rishi Sunak's government.
Well, let's talk to the Shadow Secretary of State for International Trade, Nick Thomas-Symonds, who joins us now. Good to see you this morning. The problem is when we look at all these figures, they're all retrospective, aren't they? And it's about what happens next that matters, surely.
Well, firstly, it is very good to join you on the morning show, as always. And, well, of course, figures always, by their very nature, about what has previously happened. But by them, we can judge the effectiveness of what measures the government's taking and then look at what lessons we can learn for the future. And one of the major problems in these figures, in my view, is the 250,000 people that we are recruiting to our workforce from overseas. And whilst, of course, those people will make a great contribution, I'm not saying that they won't for a moment, the fact that we are recruiting from overseas at that level is, I'm afraid, an indication of the government's complete failure on skills, their complete failure to close the skills gap here in the UK and try to ensure that workers here in the UK have got a fair chance of filling those vacancies. The government hasn't done that. And you can see why we've got the figure that we now have.
Is that a fair criticism, though, saying that it's the government who's failed to address Britain's skills shortage? Because a lot of what we're talking about here, I mean, the care sector, which relies very heavily on foreign labour, and also jobs like fruit pickers, they're jobs that British people don't particularly want to do. I mean, they don't pay enough.
Well, first of all, we've got 7 million people on hospital waiting lists, where if you were dealing with that, we'd have more people available to go into our workforce. But secondly, and you mentioned how much people are paid, we do need to end this system whereby for many occupations on the shortage occupation list, employers are able to recruit from overseas and pay people 20% less than they're actually being paid if you were to recruit them from here in the UK. That's an unfairness that should end. But also the Migration Advisory Committee, which advises the government on which occupations go on that shortage occupation list for overseas recruitment, we should be linking that to skills bodies here in the UK so that whenever, for a short-term basis, which is what it should be, employers have had to recruit from overseas, the government has to link it to upskilling our workforce here in the UK. It's absolutely vital they do it. And by the way, businesses up and down the country, I meet them regularly in my own role as Shadow International Trade Secretary, are crying out for a skills strategy from the government. The government's been promising to act on this for years, but just hasn't done it. And that's why we're in a situation where they're having to recruit 250,000 workers from overseas.
The Labour policy going to be on this then? Is it about, would you like to train more Brits? Do you want to? Is the position that you would reduce that net migration figure?
We want that net migration figure to come down, and we expect it to come down. And yes, we would be looking to train and upskill our workforce. A couple of practical examples.
Oh, okay.
We would, for example, be changing the apprenticeships levy. The apprenticeships levy at the moment is very restricted in terms of what it can be used for. It should be an apprenticeship and skills levy so we can upskill our workforce. And we should, by the way, be ending the non-dom tax status so that people pay tax on all their income here in the UK and use that money to run the biggest recruitment drive for the NHS in its history.
OK, but so you say the figure needs to come down to what sort? I mean, I know it's not about setting targets. We know that's a disaster, frankly. But to what sort of ballpark figure? If 600,000 is too much, what's acceptable?
Well, I think the answer is in the question, Stephen, in a sense, because I don't think it's wise to set, ballpark figures or targets, because we know that approach is completely and utterly discredited. We've had Conservative Prime Minister after Conservative Prime Minister setting targets that have never been met, that frankly have just resulted in even less confidence in the system. So what our focus is, as I've indicated, to identify those areas where we think the figure is too high and government policy can make a difference. And the one, as I indicated in my previous answer in particular, is this issue of recruiting visas and issuing visas at far too high a rate to workers from overseas. And that's something where we definitely be looking to get the figures down.
Nick Thomas-Symonds, really good to see you. As always, thank you very much indeed.